Hello audience, Mr. Z here. When I say European empires, you probably think of France, Britain, Rome, maybe even Spain or Russia, but what is perhaps one of the most overlooked and underappreciated of the European empires is Sweden, specifically under King Charles, or Carl XII. Charles was only 15 when he ascended the throne and would go on to personally lead victory after victory against the Triple Alliance of Denmark, Norway, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, in what would become known as the Great Northern War. After easily dispatching Denmark-Norway, forces within Poland and Lithuania would still relent, but were ultimately put down and turned into a puppet state of Sweden. And while initially beating the Russians in earlier battles, Charles had failed to launch a finishing blow, instead shifting his focus to Poland and Lithuania, thus allowing the Russians to remobilize and seize the port city which would become known as St. Petersburg. Charles would siege the settlement, but the Russians refused to abandon it, even going as far as to have Tsar Peter attempt to negotiate a surrendering off of other Russian territories in exchange for St. Petersburg alone, which would be his only warm water port into Western Europe, which, if you know anything about Peter the Great, you'd know he was infatuated with. Charles of Sweden, however, would not accept these terms, and being the cocky young spitfire that he was, decided, I'm not just going to capture St. Petersburg, I'm going to capture Moscow. Thus, Charles would redirect his troops toward Minsk and begin his long journey. Peter the Great, not being one to underestimate his foes, took up the ancient Russian tradition of scorched earth policy, destroying the bridges, towns, and resources that would otherwise be used to aid and resupply the invading Swedish army. This would force Charles to go further south to resupply, and in hopes of negotiating an alliance out of local Cossacks. In our timeline, only 3,000 of the promised 30,000 Cossacks appeared to support the Swedes, and this would spell the beginning of the end for Charles and his army. However, let's suppose that in this timeline, Charles does receive his support of 30,000, as well as whatever supplies they can bring with them. Now, you may think that this wouldn't nearly be enough to turn the tides for the Swedish army. However, Charles had a knack for making a whole lot out of a dire and scant situation. He had, time and time again, through quick thinking and devilishly tactical maneuvers, overpowered armies which far outnumbered his own. It is with that in tow that he'd be able to mount a rapid push northward, capturing enough resources to keep his men moving before the Russians had a chance to burn them. Charles knew that time was of the essence, and the speed at which he traveled could be the difference between a meal and starvation, victory and defeat. It is with tremendous speed that Charles's army would reach Moscow, and there would wage a long and arduous battle against Tsar Peter, one which would end in a Swedish victory. St. Petersburg is captured, and former parts of Russia annexed into the Swedish Empire. Peter the Great's ambitions of westernizing Russia would be dealt a major blow, leaving his empire to fall to the wayside of European affairs. Upon his return to Sweden, Charles would be full of vigor and, just as in our timeline, still aching for further war. He was advised that given the tremendous losses and exhaustion from the Russian campaign, he'd be wise not to overexert himself. And while Charles was famous for disregarding the authority of others, he'd be foolish not to see the war weariness in his men, and would resolve to simply finish off what was started by invading Denmark-Norway and installing a king loyal to him for the sake of keeping his own kingdom safe from neighboring threats. Military conquest would come to a brief halt, and Sweden would experience a golden age of peace and prosperity. What remained for Charles were diplomatic engagements and directing the affairs within his own kingdom, the most notable of which would be the signing of an act of union, merging Denmark-Norway with Sweden to create a unified Scandinavia. As years passed, Charles began to worry that he was becoming too old to engage in what was becoming one of his greatest passions, conquest. But around him, there didn't seem much he could do short of instigate a war with the British, and then it struck him. Colonization. He had heard tales of the indigenous tribes that the British and French would engage in combat with, and thought he might have a look for himself. A mass colonization movement was launched for Greenland, and, to his disappointment, he did not find much opposition, thus leading him to engage in the American Indian Wars on the side of the British, finding it a new and exciting challenge going up against surprise and stealthy war tactics and securing a great deal of territory for the British, with whom he developed a closer alliance and eventually developed some influence over. Charles' last on-field presence would be during the 7 Years' War, once again aiding the British against the French and natives. Charles would return home and continue to oversee the growth of his empire, and eventually being succeeded by his son, Charles XIII, who would establish close ties with Austria, reconquer Poland, and become a major general in the Napoleonic Wars. Considering the paradigm shift between Russia and Scandinavia, Russia becomes a far smaller player in the Napoleonic Wars, or may even operate as a proxy state given Peter's hopes of westernization now depend heavily on Sweden, which, along with the Ottomans, controlled Russia's access to Western Europe. In the end, Napoleon would now be facing off against a fortified Britain, Scandinavia, and restructured Austria, who after Prussia was assimilated by Scandinavia, its infancy, would go on to dominate Germanic Europe. Thank you all for watching, be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.